It began in silence. Inside the Great Marble Hall of the United Nations, every delegate sat upright, cameras fixed, waiting. In the hands of Ibrahim Traoré lay 12 pages of apology carefully typed, stamped, and polished by foreign diplomats. A speech designed to soften his voice, to erase his defiance, and to remind a small African nation of its place. But instead of reading, he folded the paper in half. That single gesture was louder than any applause. It was the sound of chains breaking. Tell me, he began, his voice steady yet sharp, when has the world ever apologized to Africa? The question hung in the air, heavier than stone. French delegates shuffled uneasily. The American desk froze. And across the chamber, whispers turned into shock. This was not the script. This was not compliance. This was something the world had not heard from a young African leader in decades, unfiltered truth. And suddenly, the real question was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about all of us. Who writes the story of nations long treated as spectators? Who decides whether dignity can be traded for aid, whether sovereignty must be surrendered for access to markets? For generations, Africa was told to bow while trillions of dollars crossed oceans, but its people were asked to swallow humiliation. Now, one man had flipped the script. Was it reckless? Was it heroic? Or was it the spark of a new era? As Americans watching from afar, we must ask ourselves if dignity can be silenced in Africa, how long before truth is silenced everywhere. So stay with us. In this video, we'll uncover not just a speech, but a turning point that may shape the destiny of an entire continent. And if you believe that truth should never be scripted by others, share this story. Subscribe, because voices like these are more important than headlines. The storm that shook the United Nations did not appear out of thin air. It had been building for weeks, fueled by a single spark: Ibrahim Traoré's words about Gaza. At a time when many leaders remained cautious, calculating every phrase to avoid offending powerful capitals, Traoré spoke plainly. He condemned the silence, questioned the double standards, and voiced solidarity with civilians caught in the crossfire. For the people of Africa, his honesty was refreshing. For the corridors of power in Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv, it was incendiary. Almost overnight, phones lit up. Diplomatic cables flew back and forth. Western media outlets began to speculate whether this young president had overstepped. Then came the announcement: a special session at the United Nations. The official language was neutral, an opportunity to clarify remarks, but everyone knew what it really meant. Clarification was code for apology, and apology was code for surrender. Behind closed doors, the pressure was immense. Burkina Faso is landlocked, rebuilding its fragile economy, and highly vulnerable to outside leverage. Threats circulated quickly, whispers of suspended aid, hints of canceled trade deals, even sanctions that could block the flow of gold and cotton exports worth hundreds of millions of US dollars. To a country where the average citizen lives on less than $1,000 a year, these were not abstract numbers. They were lifelines. In New York's glass towers, the drama grew darker. The U.S. ambassador arrived unannounced with a leather briefcase. Inside were satellite images, dossiers on Burkina Faso's contracts with Chinese firms valued at over $1.2 billion, and intelligence reports alleging Russian advisors operating on Burkina soil. The message was clear: we know everything. The conversation that followed shifted from polite diplomacy to a performance of intimidation. Aid freezes, credit downgrades, and sanctions were whispered like daggers wrapped in velvet. Yet pressure was only half the strategy. Soon came the lure of compromise. Offers of hundreds of millions in economic support, preferential access to U.S. markets, even development partnerships, all conditioned on one simple act: retract your words and read the prepared script. 12 pages long, line by line, it was not merely a speech. It was a confession, a public submission staged for cameras worldwide. This was the true battlefield, not on dusty Sahel roads, but in diplomatic backrooms where financial power becomes political chains. Neo-colonial bargaining dressed in the language of cooperation. For Traoré, the dilemma was stark: survival through silence or dignity through defiance. Back home, the stakes were no less real. Burkina Faso is a nation fighting to rebuild after years of instability. Every dollar in aid, every trade agreement means hospitals supplied, schools kept open, and salaries paid. Yet beneath the surface, something deeper was stirring. Citizens began asking whether survival purchased at the price of humiliation could ever be called true survival. Was prosperity without dignity worth more than struggle with self-respect? This tension framed the stage as Traoré prepared to address the United Nations. On one side, immense external pressure sharpened by threats of economic isolation. On the other, a rising wave of expectation at home and across Africa. Social media campaigns, grassroots flyers, and community rallies began to spread the message Africa does not apologize. In the capital, Ouagadougou, young people organized marches timed precisely with the UN session. Flags waved, chants thundered, and hashtags multiplied. The voice of the street was becoming impossible to ignore. Analysts would later note that the publicity generated by these rallies amounted to over $50 million in free global media coverage. But in the moment, the numbers mattered less than the symbolism. What was unfolding was bigger than Burkina Faso. It was the question of who truly controls the narrative of nations long dismissed as powerless. And so by the time Ibrahim Traoré walked into the marble halls of the United Nations, the battle lines had already been drawn. The world expected an apology. His people expected resistance. Between those two expectations stood a young leader with 12 pages in his hand and a choice that would define not only his presidency, but perhaps the political future of a continent. The silence in the United Nations chamber was almost unbearable. Delegates leaned forward, pens poised, waiting for Ibrahim Traoré to begin reading the carefully crafted script they had placed in his hands. 12 pages of apology, printed, bound, and rehearsed to signal surrender. But instead, with deliberate calm, he folded the paper in half. The rustle of that gesture echoed louder than any microphone. Then came the words that pierced the room like a blade. "Tell me, when has the world ever apologized to Africa?" The air seemed to thicken. A French delegate shuffled his notes. Across the aisle, the American desk froze mid-scribble. Whispers spread like wildfire in French, English, and Arabic. This was not the performance the chamber expected. This was not an apology. It was an indictment. From that moment, the script was no longer in the hands of Western diplomats. Traoré took control. He spoke of double standards, how bombs dropped in foreign wars are called defense. But when poverty cripples African children, it is dismissed as economics. He painted a picture not of anger, but of clarity, a mirror held up to the hypocrisy of global diplomacy. Then came a pivot no one anticipated. Reaching into his pocket, Traoré unfolded a small handwritten note. He explained it was from a little girl in Ouagadougou. "Please tell them we don't want to be poor forever. Please tell them we are not children. We are a people." For a moment, the chamber forgot politics. Diplomats accustomed to rehearsed speeches now heard the raw voice of a child. The silence was heavy, some scribbling furiously, others staring blankly at the floor. And then came the thunderclap. "Yes, I will apologize," Traoré declared. A ripple of surprise swept through the hall. Heads lifted, whispers turned into gasps. But before relief could settle, he finished, "I apologize only for one thing, that until today, no one has dared to speak like this before you." The chamber froze. The line was destined for headlines, for highlight reels, for viral clips subtitled in dozens of languages. It was the reversal of a trap. What was meant as humiliation became triumph. The French delegation stood abruptly, gathered their papers, and marched out without a word. Their exit was symbolic, a refusal to legitimize defiance. Yet outside the chamber, the reaction was far from silence. News alerts lit up phones across the globe. Traoré rejects UN apology script. Social media erupted. Diaspora communities in New York, London, and Paris began posting clips of the speech with captions like, "Africa doesn't apologize," and "Dignity is not negotiable." Within 24 hours, analysts estimated that the unpaid media coverage generated by the speech equaled more than $120 million in advertising value. What diplomats withheld in applause, the public returned in visibility. On the streets, the reaction was electric. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands filled the squares, waving flags and chanting slogans. In Johannesburg, graffiti artists painted his words on walls, "Africa doesn't apologize." A rapper in Dar es Salaam released a track sampling his voice, streamed millions of times within days. In classrooms from Dakar to Nairobi, students read aloud the question, "When has the world ever apologized to Africa?" Even in the United States, African American and Caribbean activists marched in solidarity carrying placards that read, "No apology for truth." CNN and BBC cameras zoomed in on the crowds forced to broadcast an image of resistance they could not control. The ripple spread beyond Africa. In the Caribbean, student unions adopted his words as slogans. In the Pacific Islands, leaders invoked the Burkina lesson, never let vulnerability be mistaken for weakness. Even indigenous groups in North America borrowed the phrase, chanting, "We don't apologize for existing." What was meant to be a moment of submission had detonated into a cultural, political, and global climax. The harder Western powers pushed, the more the defiance multiplied. The script of surrender was not just rejected, it was burned and replaced with something far more dangerous, to the status quo, a living movement carried by millions. And so the question now shifted. No longer was it simply about Burkina Faso or one leader's courage. It was about whether the guardians of global power could still dictate the narrative, or whether the stage itself had already shifted beneath their feet. The echoes of Traoré's defiance did not end inside the UN chamber. They spilled onto the streets, into classrooms, and across the airwaves, transforming a single act of refusal into a civic movement that reshaped politics and society. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, tens of thousands gathered in Independence Square. Students waved homemade placards reading, "Dignity is not negotiable." Mothers brought their children, saying they wanted the next generation to remember this day as their second independence. Local radio stations replayed Traoré's words every hour, and cafes buzzed with conversations about sovereignty, not survival. For many, Burkinabe politics had always felt distant, something negotiated by elites in marble halls. Now it was personal. The diaspora responded with equal force. In New York, African taxi drivers shut down entire streets outside the UN headquarters, honking horns in rhythm to chants of "Africa doesn't apologize." In Paris, students from immigrant neighborhoods marched through boulevards holding aloft both French and African flags to show that identity could not be divided by colonial history. In London, Caribbean activists joined hands with African youth, linking their struggles across oceans. The message was clear: what happened at the UN was no longer just a national issue, it was a shared cause. Culture quickly became a battlefield of expression. Within days, graffiti in Johannesburg, Dar es Salaam, and Nairobi carried stenciled images of Traoré's face alongside his words. A popular South African singer released a ballad titled "No Apology," which hit 1 million streams in less than a week. In Tanzania, hip-hop artists remixed his speech over heavy beats, turning diplomacy into dance music. And in classrooms, teachers used the speech as a teaching tool, inviting students to debate whether dignity was worth more than aid. Politics had spilled beyond institutions into daily life. The political consequences inside Africa were equally dramatic. Inspired by Traoré, Tanzania announced a renegotiation of contracts with multinational mining firms, demanding that 60% of profits stay within the country. Economists estimated this would add over $2 billion annually to the national budget. Zambia soon followed, tightening rules on copper exports and requiring technology transfer for any foreign company operating within its borders. In Mogadishu, Somali leaders announced plans for a phased withdrawal of foreign troops, framing it as a step toward true sovereignty. Burkina Faso itself wasted no time. Within months, grain production surged, meeting 95% of national demand, a milestone once thought impossible. New investments in irrigation and cooperative farms reduced reliance on imported food, saving over $300 million annually in foreign reserves. A sovereign wealth fund was launched, seeded by revenues from gold refining projected to accumulate $1.5 billion in 5 years. These were not abstract promises. They were visible shifts felt in the price of bread at markets and the availability of textbooks in schools. But every step forward came with resistance. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds, citing procedural reviews. The IMF postponed a debt restructuring session, exposing Burkina Faso to repayment pressures worth nearly 8% of its GDP. French media published editorials labeling Traoré reckless and unstable. Behind the polite language of finance and journalism was a calculated tightening of pressure points. And yet the backlash only deepened solidarity. Diaspora remittances spiked by $30 million in 2 days as ordinary people voted with their wallets. Across the Sahel, citizens coined a new phrase: the Angry Surge. Africa is not on its knees. It was more than a slogan. It was a psychological revolution. Markets, bus stations, and even churches echoed with discussions about sovereignty. Mothers told their children they were living through a second independence. This was the paradox. Every attempt to isolate Burkina Faso only amplified the sense of unity. What began as one leader refusing to read a script had evolved into a continental awakening. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract principle debated in parliaments, it was a lived experience shaping the daily choices, hopes, and pride of millions. From Washington to Brussels, Traoré's defiance at the United Nations was received not as a passing headline, but as a potential contagion. What if other African leaders followed the same path? What if the Burkinazo model, dignity before debt, sovereignty before surrender, spread across the continent? In the United States, policymakers were divided. Some in the State Department argued that Burkina Faso was too small to matter strategically, a landlocked nation with limited global leverage. But others saw the danger. A confidential memo leaked from Capitol Hill admitted the real fear: Traoré's message resonates beyond borders. If it shapes public opinion in Africa, U.S. influence could erode faster than our financial leverage can compensate. Behind the closed doors of think tanks, analysts warned that Africa's youth, the fastest growing demographic on Earth, might embrace this defiance as their political North Star. The White House faced its own dilemma. Should it punish Burkina Faso harshly to set an example, or downplay the incident to prevent amplifying Traoré's image? Sanctions risked pushing Burkina Faso further toward Russia and China, both eager to present themselves as partners of sovereignty. But silence looked like weakness. Either way, America's posture revealed an uncomfortable truth: for once the United States was reacting, not dictating. Across the Atlantic, France responded with characteristic fury. French media outlets ran coordinated op-eds describing Traoré as reckless and dangerous for Africa's future. Yet the very intensity of the critique betrayed Paris's deeper fear. For decades, France had maintained influence in West Africa through financial structures like the CFA franc and military bases justified by counterterrorism. Now, one young captain had shattered the illusion of dependency. Each editorial written in Paris only deepened resentment across the Sahel, where citizens had long viewed French presence as neo-colonial occupation. At the European Union, officials worried less about Burkina Faso itself and more about the precedent. Brussels quietly froze development funds, hoping to pressure Ouagadougou without making headlines. An internal panic memo later leaked admitted the unspoken concern: if Burkina Faso succeeds in surviving isolation, it may inspire other nations to reject IMF conditionalities and EU aid packages. The fear was not about one man's speech, it was about losing control of a continent's economic future. Elsewhere, the ripples spread in unexpected ways. In the Caribbean, student unions carried banners reading "No apology for our survival." Pacific Island leaders, long silenced in climate negotiations, invoked what they called the Burkina lesson: never let vulnerability be mistaken for weakness. Indigenous communities in North America echoed the slogan, "We don't apologize for existing," tying their struggles for land and water rights to the same spirit of defiance. China and Russia watched with quiet satisfaction. Beijing emphasized its partnerships in agriculture and infrastructure, portraying itself as the ally that doesn't demand apologies. Moscow's media outlets broadcast Traoré's speech widely, framing him as proof that the West's grip on Africa was slipping. Both powers saw opportunity in the cracks to offer alternatives where Washington and Brussels had once monopolized. And yet the most significant reactions came not from governments, but from people. Across Africa and its diaspora, millions saw in Traoré's defiance not just political theater, but a validation of their dignity. For every euro withheld in Brussels, new remittances flowed from Parisian suburbs and New York boroughs. For every editorial dismissing Burkina Faso as reckless, new songs, murals, and protests declared the opposite: that Africa had found its voice. For Americans, the question is sobering. If dignity can be weaponized into global solidarity, then financial leverage alone may no longer guarantee influence. The United States must now ask itself, will it cling to an outdated model of control or adapt to a world where Africa speaks on its own terms? The marble walls of the United Nations have heard countless speeches, most forgotten within hours. But what Ibrahim Traoré did that day cannot be forgotten. By folding 12 pages of apology, he unfolded a question larger than any single nation: can dignity be negotiated, or must it stand above every dollar, every deal, every alliance? The aftershocks prove this was no passing gesture. Across Africa, students chant his words in classrooms. Artists paint his defiance across city walls. Economists speak of a Burkinazo model where sovereignty outweighs dependency, and ordinary families, whether in Ouagadougou, Dakar, or the Caribbean, feel pride that their struggle is no longer invisible. What began as silence in New York has become an anthem sung on the streets. Yet history teaches us that every movement meets resistance. Already Brussels has frozen funds, the IMF has tightened its grip, and Western media frames Traore as reckless. These are not just punishments. They are warnings to anyone who might follow his path. The question is whether this wave of defiance will endure or whether it will be suffocated under the weight of financial and political pressure. For Americans watching from afar, this story carries its own warning. If a small landlocked nation can inspire solidarity across continents with nothing but words, then the old tools of power, aid, sanctions, and silence may no longer hold. Influence is shifting. Narrative itself has become a battlefield, and in that fight, Africa has found a new voice. So we must ask, do you believe this is only the courage of one young leader or the awakening of an entire continent? Is Ibrahim Traoré a lone rebel or the symbol of a generation that will no longer bow to scripts written abroad? And most importantly, can this model of dignity over dependency succeed, or will it collapse under the weight of global finance? Your voice matters in this conversation. Share your perspective in the comments. Should Africa stay the course of sovereignty, even if it risks isolation, or must compromise remain the price of survival? If you believe dignity should never be negotiable, please share this video. If you feel you are among the first to witness Africa's new era, let others know. And if you believe, as we do, that truth is more important than headlines, subscribe so that together we can keep amplifying the voices that refuse to apologize. Because history is being written now, and it will remember who chose silence and who dared to speak.